Okay, YouTube.
Hello.
All right, you were waiting for the YouTube. Fine.
So now we are live on Facebook, live on YouTube, and all we need is for Stephen to tell us 1, 2, 3, go.
Okay. Yeah, he's disappeared, but anyway.
So
Uh,
Steve, is Stephen around? He has vanished from the cyberspace.
I
that's what I was
think
saying.
I think I'll step in.
Yes.
Oh, great, Grace. Go ahead.
Good evening.
Okay.
Good evening.
Hi.
Hi. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the third part of this conversation series titled Ocean as a Method. In the first part, we had an interesting conversation with authors Yvonne Adhiambo Over and Alvin Pang. In the second series, we had the fabulous Amitav Ghosh. In the third part, we have none other than M.G. Vassanji. To organize this, we have Professor Dilip Menon and Professor Nishat Zaidi. We all know as we know, Professor Dilip Menon is a Mellon Chair of Indian Studies and the Director of the Center for Indian Studies in Africa at the University of Witwatersrand. He was educated at the universities of Delhi, Oxford, and Cambridge. He's a translator from the Malayalam and writes on film, theatre, and literature. His research for the past decade has engaged with the issues of caste, socialism, and ocean in modern India. This has resulted in several essays and a monograph on issues of caste in modern India, and also a translation of the first novel written in Indian language. Currently, he's working on the issues of cultural and intellectual history and is engaged in a project on writing the history in India between 1850 and 1960. The work inaugurated at the center is interdisciplinary and transnational in approach and looks afresh at issues of colonialism, modernity, and migration. Dr. Nishat Zaidi is professor and head Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. Her research interests include post-colonial writings, Indian literature in English translation, comparative literature, and women's writing. A scholar, critic, and translator, she has 10 books and a number of published papers to her credit. She has co-edited Story is a Vagabond, fiction, essays, and drama by Intisar Hussain, and her translation of Day and Dastan is a most recent publication. Over to you, Professor Nishat Zaidi. Over to you, Professor Dilip Menon.
Thank you, Grace. Uh, I'm really delighted to welcome all to the third edition of our series, Writing the Ocean. As Grace rightly pointed out, in the first series, we were joined by two brilliant young writers, Kenyan novelist Yvonne Adhiambo Ovior and Singaporean poet and writer Alvin Pang. Coming from littoral societies, both these writers spoke of the centrality of oceanic imagination in their writings. While Yvonne talked about the need for a grammar to define locations, Alvin Pang explained how through his poetry he has tried to convey the confluent mesh of meanings. In the second edition of the series, we had Amitav Ghosh, whose works attempt to comprehend temporalities of historical flows through the paradigm of oceanic circulation of water. Ghosh spoke of how an engagement with oceanic flows enhances our understanding of planetarity. He spoke of the extraordinary phenomenon of circulation of pidgin languages in Indian Ocean region, which he said are a sort of re-lexification of older structures. Ghosh also spoke of his personal history of displacement, complicity of modernity with imperialism and capitalism, and most importantly, environment change, and many more issues. Today in this series, I feel privileged to have with us none other but M.G. Vassanji, or Moez Ghulam Hussain Vassanji, an internationally acclaimed writer, of course. He was born in 1950 in Kenya in a family of East African Asians and raised in Tanzania. He attended MIT and the University of Pennsylvania, where he specialized in nuclear physics before moving to Canada as a postdoctoral fellow in 1978. From 1980 to 1989, he was a research associate at the University of Toronto. During this period, he developed a keen interest in Indian literature and history, co-founded and edited a literary magazine, and began writing fiction. His fame as a writer began in 1989 when he published his first novel, The Gunny Sack, which to this day is celebrated for its nuanced treatment of India, Africa, Canada, transoceanic connections, of movements of men and material across spaces and linguistic and national boundaries. The book, not surprisingly, the book won a regional Commonwealth Writers Prize in 1990. Ever since, there has been no looking back for M.G. Vassanji. He's the author of 9 novels, 2 collection of short stories, a travel memoir about India, a memoir of East Africa, and several biographies. He is the winner of he's twice winner of Giller Prize for Best Work of Fiction in Canada, Governor General's Prize, and so many others. It's not possible to list all his achievements right here. His 2007 novel, The Assassin's Song, was also shortlisted for Gilner's Prize. I wonder if any one of us who has read the novel, and I'm sure most of us have read the novel, can never deny the overpowering influence of this novel. I also taught this novel for many years to my MA students. His works have been translated into Dutch, French, German, Hindi, Italian, Japanese, Latvian, Portuguese, Spanish, and so many languages of the world. He has written introductions, edited books, and he has also written biography of Mahatma, introduction to autobiography of Mahatma Gandhi. So, what are you, M.G. Vassanji? No, this is not a question to you. This is the title of his forthcoming collection of short stories. So thank you so much, Dr. Vassanji, for taking out time and coming to us. What an extraordinary trajectory of life, vocations, and locations you have been affiliated with. So without much ado, let's start the conversation, and we can begin at the beginning, as this in Ganisak, Salim's teacher tells him. In the in-between world of Vikram Lal, you write that it was poverty at home that pushed Indians across the ocean to Africa. But surely there is that wanderlust for itch in the soul, as in SOLE, and the hankering of the soul, that is SOUL, that puffs out the sail for journey into the totally unknown. In your novels, you have related medieval Indian Ocean migrations to colonial and post-colonial migrations. Do you have any thoughts on how an Indian Ocean history of migration has contributed to the making of modern globalized world? Do you think that history has shaped the modern world? What are your views about, because your novels keep going back to these roots, from history to myth. So how do you think that history, medieval history, has shaped this modern world or contributed to the creation of globalized world? Over to you.
I look at people as individuals. That's like my stories are about people, and in terms of contributing to any large-scale movement, it's just by existing and being who they are, and being part of the worlds in which they have moved. So, by being in East Africa, they've contributed to life in East Africa. By moving to the West, they've contributed here, and it's hard to see, for me as a novelist, to see people as more than just individuals. But it's only when you move away from the novel and look back at what you've written that you see maybe you know we are part of a global movement, but everyone is, in a sense, having come from somewhere or just being in a place, have contributed to the places in which they live. And I think that is what I think in terms of contribution. But if you look for individual contributions, then in East Africa you have people who became cabinet ministers or important intellectuals. In Canada, you have the mayor of one city, or you have in England you have the chancellor of the exchequer, who is son of migrants from Kenya, and so on. But 10 years down the road, who might remember them? I think in terms of contributions, it's just people being what they are, and in very minute ways adding to what we are as humanity.
I think that's interesting what you said, because what you're saying is instead of thinking at the big, great forces of history with a capital H, you're looking at individuals, you're looking at their movements, and the ways in which all of these lives come together in order to create these bigger histories that we know of, as also individual achievements. An Indian who is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, no greater irony at the after empire can there be.
Exactly.
But one of the things that actually I would like to follow up on this is if one is looking at the Indian Ocean world, as Nishat said, and these movements of people, does it make sense to think with nations and national histories anymore? And what do you feel?
But for me, of course, it. But ironically, that's how the world has gone, becoming more and more rigid. The more independent we become, the more knowledge we have, the stricter the boundaries we put around ourselves. So even with the use of the internet and global communication, you find that people use the very instrument of the internet to communicate with people who think are like them. So basically putting walls around them. And this I find personally not to my taste, in fact, very disturbing. That having come out into the world, people in Canada or Australia or the United States, they reach out to each other because they, in one example, they belong to a small community which may not be more than 100,000. So that's what we have become. Nations, India and Pakistan, stricter and stricter boundaries, more hatred, close to the brink of war. In other places, that before there was a fluidity in our identities. We did not identify as one exclusively, or one to the exclusion of the other. But that's what we have become, and that, of course, is for me, coming with my background, is antithetical.
Thank you. Nishat, may I continue with this?
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
because this is something that what you point out, this fluidity, and I think that's a wonderful word to think with also because Nishat and I have been engaged in this larger project. She in literature, me in history, trying to think about histories on the ocean, histories of the ocean, and it's very difficult, as you say, to pin down identities, pin down territories, and this is part of the conversation we were having with Amitav Ghosh and earlier with Yvonne Awar as well. But one central idea in your work, and indeed in the title of your book, The In Between World of Vikram Lal, I think it's a wonderful word to think with, where one lives one's lives in between places, between the water and the land, between nations, between races. And so, what I want to ask you is around this word itself, this idea of being in between, on the threshold between places, between races. And of course, you might be familiar with that figure in Indian mythology, the king Trishanku, who's
Yes,
suspended between the.
just
Uh, uh,
writing about that.
yes, it's a very potent metaphor, and a literary critic has actually referred to this when writing about you. It's central to your work. And I think, what we would like to hear more from you is how does one think about this idea of belonging? Because belonging is so central to our idea of being human, of idea of being rooted and so on. But in all your work, this experience of belonging is related to the question of non-belonging, or in fact, it is being in between and non-belonging that is actually a very strong belonging, as it were. It's a kind of paradox, and it's a wonderful idea to think with. I just wonder whether you could speak to us about that.
But it is a very painful concept for people of my background or my
Yeah.
experience because, you know, when I think about it, wherever I go in this part of the universe, I'm always an alien or foreigner or the other, wherever I go, to India or
Yeah.
Pakistan or Africa or even in Canada or the United States. And I'll give you an example of what I think of as belonging. Nothing that I can actually achieve. But I was about 25 years ago at the home of a friend of mine in India. And I observed that, before she left, she went to the, cabinet and did a small puja and left. And I was struck by it. I've never forgotten that image, to have that sense of she was praying to a God who, at least in people's beliefs, has been there for thousands of years, at least 2,000 years. And she comes from a country or a land where you can go to a site and say, "Oh, Lord Rama passed by here," or Sita was here, and this temple, Emperor Akbar passed through here. This was in Pathankot or somewhere. And I can never say that. I wish I was there, but of course I can't. And of course I have, in my own life, I have a freedom which I enjoy. But that sense of belonging, just complete to the land, to the sounds, to every symbol that is around you, that you feel that I've been here, my parents have been here, we've been here thousands and thousands of years, whether that's true or not. It's profound. And, for someone who's never belonged, it creates a sense of longing. But I would, of course, say that this same sense of belonging has created for a lot of wars and so on. Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's what
Yeah,
the
actually, I
Nazis
suppose,
thought.
we rue our sense of belonging and you rue your sense of non-belonging. So I
Yeah,
think we complement each other.
yeah.
Yeah.
Nishat?
No, I was just wondering. I mean, if non-belonging is also a kind of belonging, because you trace the root of not just individuals but communities. I mean, in terms of Shamsi community, the way they have traveled, from Middle East to India, from India back to Kenya and African countries, and then from there to Canada. So, I mean, is non-belonging also a kind of belonging, where
Well, it's an identity. I don't know. It's a belonging because if I go to Africa, if when I land in Dar es Salaam,
mm,
immediately I start speaking Swahili. I relate to people in a certain way. I have a familiarity with the people, which after 40 years in Canada, I cannot have a familiarity. If I walk out of my house, I behave in a certain way with the people. There are certain forms. If I'm in Africa, I'm totally different. I'm amazed at myself. My language switches, my diction switches, my accent switches. Even the air feels different. If I go to India, even though I know there are problems there, and perhaps considered a foreigner by now, although India has been very kind to me, uh, there's a sense of relief, a certain, knowing that all these problems exist, especially for a person of my background.
mm,
There is a familiarity, even in the air, in the sounds, in the way I talk to people. So, and I don't know, it's just the way I am. I'll give you an example. Once when I was traveling around Tanzania with a friend of mine who's from Kenya, and we were at this town Mwanza, Lake Victoria, and we reached a crossing, a crossroads, and there was an rising at the crossroads where a woman was selling coffee. So we went and sat there on a kind of broken bench. And we ordered 2 coffees, and the child was playing, who very much reminded me of myself, and the woman reminded me of my mother in her shop. And I looked at the women walking on the street, and there's a man across, and I told myself how much I belong to this place. I could walk to anybody and talk to them as if I had never left. But then I also had to remind myself, but I have a bank account in Toronto, Canadian
yeah,
passport. So it's this sense of, for me, it's not been easy. Other
yeah.
people, they left us out, to hell with it. They never go back. But for me, it's not been easy.
Right, right. No, you remind me of what Meena Alexander also says in her memoir, Salt Lines. Her experiences have been something, similar. She grew up in Sudan. So she says, the moment I land in Delhi, Arabic disappears and Hindi comes to my tongue. And the moment I land in Kerala, Malayalam automatically comes to my tongue and something like that. But the question that I want to ask, because before you we had Yvonne Adiambo Vior, and she very rightly pointed out that while the movement of Asians and Africans to Europe is seen as migration, movement of Europeans to Africa is never registered in a similar way. So how do you respond to this colonial imperial view of Africa and Asia, that seems to persist even today? I mean, I know in your book, And Home Was Taryaku, you have referred to this kind of situation. So, I mean, how do you think writers can deal with this or set this straight? Because you're a writer who has been traveling, as you described in your collection of stories, traveling between streets of Dar es Salaam and Toronto and Delhi. So, how do writers or novelists, deal with this situation or set straight this distorted narrative, that has been prevalent? Uh, do you see novelist tasks, are not necessarily pedagogic, or do they have to deal with this? What are your views about it?
I think novelists just describe life and people. But this whole idea of whether it's a migration or not is I think it's just words, because we all knew that the British who came to East Africa were settlers, so they were called settlers. It was a form of migration, but because they came from the ruling class, from the ruling capital, they called themselves settlers, but they were migrants. And I don't think anyone would have denied that. The only difference was that they they could immediately go back to England and be accepted, whereas people of my color might not be accepted. So every time I passed through London, on my way to Boston where I was studying, I would be harassed, you know, for half an hour, 1 hour, they would question me as if with a visa and studying at good university in the United States, I would want to go to Earl's Court and look for a job. But I think there were settlers, and some of them are still there, and their attachment to the land cannot be questioned. And now they are part of the ruling class because they are from the West. So I think it's something that I don't worry about. We know who they are, where they come from. It's just they come from the wealthier part of the globe, and they still have great influence there.
Yes, and I think, this idea of globalization that a lot of people speak about, that the world has become without borders. And we all know that there are borders for some and no borders for others. That,
Yes.
that if you have the right skin color, you're able to travel, the right passport, you're able to travel much more freely. But, when you speak about this harassment that you experienced as a young man coming through London, I mean, do you feel that even now, as you travel through these various spaces, because I'm assuming you do travel between Canada and Africa, back home and India and so on, is crossing one border necessarily for you easier than crossing another border?
No, I think everywhere I go, it's suspicion. Even going back to Africa, I mean, but once I speak Swahili, I think they welcome me in Dar es Salaam.
Right.
You know, uh, but in Tanzania, you may also face resentment. Oh, you escaped. That same in Kenya. You escaped, or you are the former colonizer or whatever. In Britain, I don't know about now. It's just that with a Canadian passport, you are treated better,
Right.
which is why many people accepted Canadian passports,
Right.
not to be harassed the rest of their lives. And going to the United States, you always worry. Even though I lived there 8 years, some of the best years of my life was spent there.
Right.
But it's always a worry because the people at the border are like guard dogs. They may not reflect the people in the house, but they are there to bark at you. And, you have to live with that. It's not easy.
Yes, and actually, this is one of the things that actually puts the brakes on all of these academic theorizing, which speaks about fluidity, speaks about the ocean as a space of movement, only the land being divided into national territories and borders and so on. Travel is difficult for certain people, travel is not difficult for other people. And I think when you write your novels, one of the things that does come across is this distinction that you make between identity and belonging. That one has an identity, and that identity is a national identity, or it's marked by the passport that you hold. Here you are, MG Vassanji, with a Canadian passport, which allows you freedom, greater freedom of movement. But this question of where you belong and whether you still have that nostalgia of belonging is not necessarily connected to that identity, or it's something you move between, back and forth. Would I
Yeah,
be
I
right
think
in
by
saying?
identity you mean citizenship.
Yes, right.
Yeah,
Yes,
because
in this case,
identity, I have many identities. we grew up with a purely communal identity. By communal, not in the Indian sense,
Right.
but what we call jati. We
Yes.
belong to the Khoja Ismaili community. That was our identity, nothing
Right.
else. From a small town, Dar es Salaam, of course, now it's a big city. And then we sort absorbed the national identity. We were Tanzanians.
Mhm.
And only later, other identities were imposed on us. So it's you're basically a victim also of global politics.
Yes, that's true. But actually, can I ask you something about your location in Canada right now? I mean, because of course, this is a place where you have been for a large part of your life, and there are many writers of like Michael Ondaatje from Sri Lanka, Rohinton Mistry from India, and there is seemingly a different kind of politics in Canada because in the United States of America, you would be classified as a South Asian writer or an African writer, and you write within certain frameworks and to certain constituencies and so on. Has your Canadian location allowed you a greater freedom to write about your experience, not merely that of any particular community, Kenyan, Indian, or multiple hyphenated identities? The location in Canada, has it allowed you to speak to something more universal than were you a writer in the United States, where this question of identity and identity politics is much stronger, I feel.
But I think in the first place, what you write. I know several questions. I lost track, but I
The
think you're
question is
right.
basically, are you freer in Canada to write as you wish rather
But
than being in?
freedom came evolved over the years. When I wrote my first novel, the situation here was such that I didn't feel comfortable. Although I was editing a literary magazine, it was basically to promote the new kind of writing that was emerging. But when I finished my first novel, which I wrote with complete abandon, and for me, the only thing was whether it would be published and read in Africa.
Right.
So I didn't even submit it to a Canadian publisher because I knew they would not understand it, would not
Mhm.
publish it. So I submitted it to the African Writers Series, which was at that time Heinemann in England.
Right.
And I also knew that one of maybe the first or one of the early editors of that series was Chinua Achebe, who had
Right.
come to our school in that. So for me, it was a big moment when they said they would publish it. It was only later when the Commonwealth Prize was announced and people were asking, why does this guy have to go to England to get published? That and other people were coming out, that things started changing. So my second novel was accepted and so on. It's Dar es Salaam to Toronto. They could put it in an ad in the newspaper. So Dar es Salaam could appear much more freely than it could.
Mhm.
So things change, and at least some of us who are lucky could write about what was important to us, what we were. There was no point raising a flag of Canada as some people tried to do to be accepted. I mean, a writer has to be honest. So there was that freedom, but and in the United States, that also has come about. But the local politics and the global politics also plays a part in how you are accepted. So for me, Canada is a small country. I came from a small country, a small community. That of course hampers me in many ways. If I was in England or the United States, I would be part of a bigger enterprise. But it has also given me a freedom. Uh, so
Right.
I've been lucky, but there are many others. And because I edited this literary magazine, it gave rise to a small publishing company, which we call Mawenzi House. Mawenzi being a second peak of Kilimanjaro. So we've not forgotten also to add to the publishing company its identity as an alternative publisher. And you realize there are people who write important books whose works are of no interest. And so, it's, I've been lucky, but others have not been lucky. But the situation is much better than it ever was.
Right. So this is actually about the politics of publishing and market for books. uh, and before that you referred to politics vis-a-vis citizenship. So I want you to take back to our theme, which is Indian Ocean. You know, historians of all kinds, you know, who have written about Indian Ocean spaces, they have described the cosmopolitan nature of Indian Ocean spaces. But your works, you know, do not necessarily endorse this view. Uh, Boundaries of nation state, caste, class barriers, you know, they seem to be imposed on or carried across the space of ocean as people who migrate, you know, they carry their biases along with them. So Asians in Africa continue to nurture racist views about Africans, and local population in Africa sort of misnurtures a kind of mistrust for Asians who migrated there. You know, you write about Idi Amin's wahi or dream that he had, in which Allah spoke to him that Asians should be shunned. So, can we say in a way that imagination of a cosmopolitanism born of movement and living within multiple geographies, it always contends with land-centric nationalist aspirations in your work? I mean, do you
Well,
think that territorial politics is too powerful to be ignored, too overwhelming?
no, the national question, of course, I dealt with earlier when I said about how, when I see people in India, how they belong totally to the soil. But in terms of caste and other sort of divisions from India that we brought, or our ancestors brought, they were in a very milder form. They were not as strict as they are in India, or they have been in India. Because for us, we just knew there were Hindus and Muslims, but we played cricket together. We went to the same schools. And when we meet East Africans of different faiths meet in Toronto, New York, they chat with each other like friends. Oh, where did you come from? Dar es Salaam. And the people, the store we buy chevro from in Toronto are from Mwanza. This place that I went to in Tanzania. So we did. They were not as strict. Some some castes may have had this problem, but we never knew about it. It was only after coming to Toronto and going to India that I realized that some of these distinct, and then reading of, because through my work as an editor, that you read about other castes and how they were treated, the Dalit writers, Valmiki and others. We didn't have that. We had the Kumbhars, made the pottery. All we knew is they were poor. Nobody said you shun them or don't talk to them or anything like that. So it was a gentler form of casteism that remained, and I think it remained partly to retain our identities. But as soon as we were out of the East Africa with that baggage, people here now intermarry and all kinds of. It's not. In fact, people who come from India
Mm.
are much more rigid, when they come here. Whereas we, when we come here, yeah, are even freer than we were in East Africa. So that the distinction is
Mm.
not there. Racism was there basically because Indians are racists. Even in India, we know that. And I'm reading the Mahabharata, 10 volumes. I'm volume 8. I'm at the end of it, and he talks about different colors and different how the Shudras came about and how they are black and so on. So we have that ancient baggage.
Mm.
But we should not forget that racism doesn't go one way. We are not superior. Other races have you know, also opinions about us. When I did my national service in Tanzania, the
Mm.
Africans had names for us. They called us all these manjis and all these, kemches. And, I think racism is vicious when it's associated with power and prestige. And
Mm.
that is where, the European racism was different from the racism of ordinary, shopkeeper. I mean, it really made no difference. The shopkeeper may be racist, but the people who come to the shops, they sit around, and some of them, from the deep interior, and they don't take showers. And we live with them, and we learn the language, especially the boys. I didn't think of it as a lasting form of discrimination. Caste, as I said, was for us very mild,
Mm.
almost unknown, to be honest, to my community.
Mm.
We had remnants. Only when I now think about, there was this group of people among us, that I realized maybe they came from a lower caste. But we told them it was not there. India, Pakistan
Yeah,
was
but
an
I,
imposition on
mm,
my as I say, on my heart, because I don't think of them as enemies or different. I was not there doing partition. My father was not there doing partition. It has been imposed on me.
Yeah, but I suppose one of the things that you're trying to say, and which is very interesting as well, is that when people live cheek by jowl with each other, they share intimate prejudices about each other as well. It's
Yes,
like I come from Kerala. Kerala is on the southwest coast. It's largely cosmopolitan. There have been no known instances of communal riots, as they're called. Deep-seated animosities between religious communities. But when you live in Kerala, you're quite aware of the fact that people share a lot of these prejudices about other communities, and they talk about each other in terms of particular characteristics and so on. So I think what you're probably trying to say is that when one thinks about the intimate relations between Africans and Indians in where you grew up, that they had prejudices about each other, but they didn't necessarily hate one another or look down on one another. Is that what you mean?
at least in Tanzania, I can say that. And on the coast,
Right.
the coast,
Mhm.
there was almost integration.
Right.
You in the interior, in Kenya, there was, because some of the Indians who came
Right.
to Kenya were directly post-independence, so they carried the prejudices with them, and they were upper classes, lawyers, and so on.
Right.
And the British were stronger there, so if you wanted any kind of business or prestige, you sided with the British, with English. So in Kenya, especially in the interior, Nairobi, where I was born, things were different. There was racism, but I'm pretty sure the Africans, they had as much
Yeah.
name calling in animosity.
Yeah, I mean, before Dilip, pass his question, I just want to add to this. You refer to Mahabharata, and we notice that mythological and historical registers tend to coincide in your writings. So, I mean, how do you reconcile the two?
Well, for me, and people from of Indian heritage, Indian Pakistani, they don't seem to understand. For me, my roots are in Gujarat. I would say they are deeper than anyone from Punjab because they probably were more polluted by the Greeks and whoever came there. But my roots are in Jamnagar and Junagadh. So my total identity, India is my heritage, ancient heritage. So I don't see Mahabharata as belonging to them or to this or this caste or
Yeah.
that caste. I read it because I find it interesting and I think I should read it because so much is talked about it. And I'm learning a lot. And in fact, when I was in graduate school, I took 2 years of Sanskrit, because I was trying to understand my own Gujarati heritage. And I thought if I learned Sanskrit, I would at least find out where some of the songs we sang in Gujarati came from, what they mean. So for me, but because of the divisions we have created in the 20th century,
Right.
it's either this or that. And I don't know. The epigraph to my novel, Assassin Song, is neti neti, neither this nor that. If you think I'm this or that, then I'm neither.
Yeah, true. Actually, since you mentioned Assassin Song, that allows me a neat segue into my question because I was going to ask you about that. It's my favorite novel of yours, and I suppose of a lot of people who've read your work. There's a particular power to it, and you've observed in interviews and elsewhere that Assassin Song is actually closest to your heart as well. And the novel, for those who haven't read it, takes us from 13th century Gujarat to 1960s United States of America and 1980s Canada before returning to Gujarat in 2002, the site of the Hindu nationalist pogrom against Muslims. Now, the narrator Karsan's father is the keeper of a Sufi shrine, as also a guardian of the bowl, a mantra of arrival, harmony, reconciliation. Now, this is a question that I wanted to ask you, a very specific question. Can you speak to us about the question of being Muslim and this question of memory and of return? I know you've been saying also about this collective heritage, of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the multiple texts, which, because of the sheer longevity, are available to everybody in India across communities. But in Assassin's Song, you address a particular moment in India's history, which then brings back, I think, this question of being Muslim or the question of return to India. And there is a longing in this novel, which actually spoke to me. There is poignancy, there is yearning, It's very different from the early Naipaul, like Area of Darkness and India Wounded Civilization, where there's a sense of distance and of, oh, this is not what I expected to find, a certain sense of horror. So this question of both of belonging and this question of being Muslim and being reminded that that composite culture that you spoke about in the just a few minutes ago was somehow under threat in 2002. And why did that become the focus in some sense of that point of return?
Well, first, some clarification. This is not a Sufi shrine, but a syncretistic
Right.
shrine. Syncretism was very common. Even now it exists, but in hidden pockets. Mahatma Gandhi's mother's family came from a community called I forget the name, Pranami sect.
Yeah.
It's not spoken about because in today's India, you have either this or that. Pranami sect had the ayahs of the Quran on the wall of the temple.
Mm-hmm.
Ours was even less of that. It was syncretistic, and there's a shrine which I visit about 3 times outside Ahmedabad, and it belongs to many people. Uh, the Hindus, go and worship there. The Shias go and worship there. The Sunnis go and worship there. And it belongs to a Pir called Pir Imam Shah in our community. The keeper of the shrine is a Patel, he's a Hindu from Lohana caste, from which my people come from. And they call him Imam Shah Baba. So it's the same one. So the stories change a bit. There is a politics going on. Everybody goes to worship there. And the prayer there is in Gujarati.
Yeah.
Some of these, we call them ginans, they're sort of like bhajans. They're in old Gujarati. They sing them and they've changed them. We sing them and they had a profound impact on me. And we have changed them, I'm sure. And other people also. So it's that kind of, we never, the identity was Khoja. So when I go there, when I go to Gujarat, especially in Kathiawar, and I say, I'm a Khoja, they say, yeah, we know the Khojas, you see, because that's a jati. It's only later that the Islamic imposition was made, because after partition, you were this or that. Well, I've refused to buy that, as I say, because I'm not a religious person, but I have a spirituality that came from hearing these bhajans or ginans since childhood. And those were the ones that I tried to understand when I studied Sanskrit and Prakrit and tried to deal with in the Assassin Song. So Assassin Song is a sect which belongs. The founder of the sect came from somewhere in the Near East. But after that, the name got changed, the stories got changed, the mythology built up, communities started forming around it, which you find in all of these shrines. And for the poor people, it means everything. And so what I imagined was what it would be like to grow up there and then go out into the wider world, where it no longer has the same hold on you as it had once. And also in a sense of responsibility, what responsibility do you have to the people for whom it means so much and for whom you mean so much? And of course, it's an analogy or an allegory of our responsibility to the poor countries we come from. Because for me, leaving East Africa, where I thought I would always return and go to teach, it's been a deep impact.
Right.
Yes, and thank you for pointing out the synthetic culture and I grew up in a small town of UP, and this is pretty much similar culture that I was raised in, where Akhand Ramayan, overnight Akhand Ramayan recitation was a part of, my oral world. And the dargahs that we went to, they were visited by Hindus and people from different castes and different communities. So yes, this is the world that we were raised in, and it's strange that those things are crumbling down. That takes me to the question of language in your work. Speaking of synthetic culture, language is also, the registers that you use. They are so sort of enmeshed with registers from multiple languages. Gujarati is there, Kutchi is there, Hindi, Punjabi, Swahili, German, English, Dutch, Portuguese. And in fact, your novel Gunny Sack, it opens with an epigraph which contains three-line excerpt from a classic Swahili poem by Sayyid Abdullah bin Nasir, and six lines in English from Yeats's poem Vacillation. So this mixing of plurality of languages, discourses, and voices coexisting within the framework of the text, it reflects a kind of long durée of crossing and mixing of people and cultures in the Indian Ocean region. So because you come from, as you mentioned, you come from Gujarat, from where there have been, migrations and mixing of people and cultures. So could you tell us, about these connections, between migrations and, history in Indian Ocean, and the question of, gunny sack of memory and languages that your novels, keep returning to? Yes.
There was a mixing, obviously, of languages, foods, very important. If you look at a cookbook from Kenya that recently came out, and they said biryani is an African dish. So, and in East Africa, many young people think chapati was an African, kind of concoction. You go, at least a few years ago, you go to any bus stop and you find a woman making chapatis. But of course, everyone has their own recipes. Their chapatis are different from the ones we make at home. The language is just they just happen. It's never planned or anything like that by the people or by a novelist. It's the language you belong to, that you spoke, uh, and it has idioms from all the other languages that were around you. And of course, as you grow older and you've moved away for a long time, you find that in the home country, at least in the country you come from, the language has changed a bit because new concepts have arrived. Last time I was there, the word for constitution was very much in vogue because the new constitution was being debated, and it was not a word that I would have come across as a young man or a boy. Uh, and uh, and here in Toronto, you find yourself suddenly breaking into English, even when you're speaking Kutchi with your spouse. But when I speak with my cousin, who's also from Qatar, but they were from Nairobi, I automatically speak Gujarati. So it's just becomes a part of you that, and I think it's a wonderful part of one. Although one also misses the sense that people who've grown up in a single or one or two languages, for example, the British or some people in India, they have a knowledge of the literary tradition of that place that I never had, and I marvel at how they suddenly break off into Shakespeare or, Yeats or whatever. And if you speak to North Indians, suddenly you're walking and someone behind you is reciting Garvi. Right?
Mm.
How wonderful. I can't do that. All I can do is Muhammad Rafi or Mukesh,
Mm.
which was all around us,
Mm.
and some of the Swahili songs, which also we used to hear from the Arab restaurants. And, those were the sounds I grew up with.
Yes, but I mean, when a writer writes about it, obviously, writer writes about it consciously. I mean, of course, it's all a part of your being as a person. But when it translates into, fictional text, obviously, I mean, there is
No, but
some scheme.
consciousness is to be conscious of being honest.
Mm,
If I write a dialogue, for me
mm,
it has to sound authentic. It has to sound real, and
mm,
it only sounds real if the syntax is arranged a certain way, if
mm,
certain words appear
mm,
and they cannot be avoided.
mm,
So it's just to be honest to the environment, to the people, the way they speak. And this has been done by I'm not Yiddish, Jewish writers. When suddenly, if you look at Jewish writing,
mm,
especially for 50s, 60s, Philip Roth, or even before, you find that people speak English differently. They'll say this thing, no, or they'll put some Yiddish word, and we do the same thing. It was not Salman Rushdie who invented it, I think the Jews did it before.
Mm. But
And
but as a writer, I mean, are you also trying to use this to make sense of the past? I mean, do you approach language also as a material object, through which you are trying to release those hidden meanings and trying to get to the basics, to the bottom of reality, past, truth, whatever.
I think that for a writer like me and like many others, it has to be unconscious. Once you start analyzing what you're writing, you're finished. You know, I mean, which is why a lot of academics, if you'll forgive me, find it so hard to write novels, because they're criticizing all the time. Whereas when I write, I don't care, what things. Later on, I may ask myself, if I'm writing, will I be understood? And I have to make a decision. Honesty versus, or I have to use some kind of trick. Sometimes what we do is put a word or a phrase or something, and then at the end, in English, put the meaning, but it has to follow the rhythm.
Yeah.
So you play little tricks like that. But it has to come from within, the novel. Otherwise, you would not even write, because it's a labor. For me, it's not a labor. It's a how do I call it? It's a compulsion. I have to do it, and this is the only way I can do it. It's the only way it comes out. And when you give birth, you can't say I want to give birth to someone who's fair or dark or blue eyes. You just give birth. You know.
Actually, there's a whole set of things that you said which are extremely interesting. The one is this thing when you said, when you write, you have to be honest, and that when you write a sentence which incorporates another language, you're writing in English, you write a sentence which incorporates another language, you have to be faithful to the rhythms of English as it is spoken, to be faithful to the rhythms of the other language as it's spoken. But you also said that when you go back, each time you go back, the language is also changing. Swahili is changing, and you come to India, Gujarati is changing, newer words are coming up, newer ideas are coming up. So, do you find yourself caught up in this in a sense of a language which was the language that you left behind in some sense when you write?
But yes, because what I've written is written about a certain time period. So,
Right.
it makes sense. But, Swahili is such a language that, the rhythm of the language has not changed,
Right.
has not changed much. So if I go in my travels in Tanzania, when I went by bus, I always travel by land there. I would go to a place, they said, where do you come from? I said, Uhuru Street, Dar es Salaam. They don't question me, because the way I speak, they know he's obviously from Uhuru Street.
Right.
But it's like in Hindi. I understand Hindi, but when my friends speak Hindi, they learned it in school. It's a literary Hindi. I can't speak literary Hindi. I don't understand it. If it's a literary Swahili with the new fangled words, those for me are new. But the rhythm of the language, how people speak on the street, how they shout to each other,
Right.
that I think has remained. But of course,
Yeah.
I've stopped writing about that period, because I'm not, I don't want to write about something I'm not intimate with.
Mhm.
So when I write about now, I may have a character, as in my last novel, who comes from Kenya but has
Right.
gone to India. So I can't write about what it's now like in Kenya unless I stay there one more year. So
Right.
the writing also changes, right?
Yeah, that was a very academic question on my part, I realize. Uh, but we all have our feelings. But the other thing that you said, which is about the fact that when people speak one language, there is this sense of a tradition, a sense of a canon, a sense of belonging. They could, somebody who's grown up entirely in England, speaks only English, has access to Shakespeare, Chaucer, etc. But I think, when I read your work and when we think about our polyglot lives, you speak three languages at least, right? Swahili, Gujarati, Kutchi, and English, and maybe others that I don't know
Some
about.
Hindi.
And some Hindi. So therefore, it's a very and through which courses Muhammad Rafi, Mukesh, Lata. So it's a much richer life of the imagination that you can summon up than if you were in possession of only one language. Do you not see this as something that is a distinct advantage that you possess?
Advantage, but we live in a world which we have not made. And it's a world dominated by English and a world dominated by the West, Western civilization. And I live in the West. If I lived in East Africa and wrote only in Swahili, I might not be so different, but I would still be faithful and comfortable. But even in East Africa, Swahili is changing with English. Yeah, so it is an advantage. But as I said, there's this, you're constrained by where you are, not only globally, but also nationally. Uh, but in my new collection of stories, I have one stories where two men, older men, are quoting old Hindi songs to each other. And I've
Right.
used totally the Hindi, and I would explain
Yeah.
sometimes. But each line for Talat or, Hemant Kumar or whatever, reminds them of their mother or, how they used to go to cinema. And some of it is, of
Right.
course, as the narrator finds out, his memories that are made up. But it's a story that is made up of just lines from songs. Because I thought I have to do it once in my lifetime. I do what I want to do.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean because a lot of our affective relationships as Indians with each other is woven through Hindi film songs. And you meet an Indian who's grown up in Kenya or anywhere else, immediately you can sing the songs that are part of that collective heritage. But
Yes.
I'd like to ask you one final question from my side before Nishat closes off and we go on to questions from the audience, which I'm sure is raring to ask you even more questions. I just wanted to ask you about the very pointedly titled A Place Within, which is an account at one level of your travel to India, rediscovering, as you call it. And it kind of resonates with Nehru's discovery of India, which is kind of redolent with expectation, longing, the idea of engaging with the homeland of one's ancestors. However, there's also a sense of distance. And there's something that you've spoken about earlier as well. But I just want to ask you something that's connected to that. You said in an interview that in the fiction of the Indian diaspora, you get upper middle class stories, but not the heart and soul of India. The real stories, you say, are told in Gujarati, Hindi, Malayalam, and so on and so forth. I couldn't agree more since I speak Malayalam and I come from Kerala. I find this speaks to me. But could you speak to us about this aspiration to authenticity? This distinction that you make between some who have only access to a middle class life, whereas those who write and who write in English, and those who write in the regional languages somehow capture something of the soul of India. Is there a real India? Is there a real Africa? Since literature
I
is a
guess
space of imagination,
to
right?
use authenticity, perhaps not people would object to it, and maybe they're right.
Right.
But if you're writing in English and your major publishers are in Britain or the United States, and perhaps you've been educated in England, then it's natural that you're sort of somehow shaped. Your writing is shaped by the expectations of your readership. Your language changes, the subjects change. I don't think in the West, at least to my experience, there's a lot of interest in the politics, for example, India or Africa, or something of global interest, politics or corruption or anything drastic that's going on that you can put your hands on from here. But the life, for example, of a family in a little town or even a big town doesn't hold that much interest, I think, in the West. But a life of an ordinary person in Ontario, for example, is a big thing here. It sells. It gets published in the New Yorker,
Mhm.
yeah, and Atlantic or whatever. So that kind of life, if you want to read about, I think you go to and it's my experience. People can prove me wrong, but I find that when I read Indian literature, I'm reading mostly, although I don't read much fiction these days. You know, translations. Some of them are not good translations, but you can still get an idea. So I read Bashir, Muhammad Bashir, whom I happened to meet, Thagadi, and then in Punjabi, what I forget her name now, the famous writer. I'm presently
Krishna
translating
Sobti?
Krishna Sobti, yeah,
Yeah.
Krishna Sobti, yeah. And I'm reading I'm not editing. I just finished editing a translation of a book from Tamil that's set in Sri Lanka. So those, when I read them, I find the village life, and maybe it's because of my own simple upbringing, brought up in a humble home, that they speak to me. That or reading some Urdu story, Kuratulain Haidar, or I don't know the names of others, but I happen to have edited, or as an editor of a literary magazine, seen a lot of Urdu stories. Somehow they, although they tend to be very depressing, but they somehow I can click to them. Whereas stories written in English are for a certain audience, maybe some personal bias. Often they deal, as I said, with politics, global politics,
Right.
or with exoticism. Once an agent told me, "Oh, this writer has been sold to so many countries. She's doing so well. Now she's doing research in India, going back to look at all these yogis and elephants and so on." So that kind of thing. You know. So as I said, this could be my own bias, but I have a affinity for writing like Bashir's or Krishna
Right.
Sob, where I feel I can touch the people.
Mhm.
Mm.
Nishat?
Yes. Uh, Before I pass it on to Grace and Mariam to take up questions from the audience, a chat box, I have two more questions, both academic, maybe, but still, I'm tempted to ask both these questions. Since you mentioned your reading choices and the kind of fiction that you read, the gunny sack has often been seen as a kind of mirror image of in an antique land. So I was just wondering that as a writer, who has been affiliated with three continents and whose works have consistently engaged with entanglements of religion, geographies, memory, material objects, etc. How do you see your work vis-a-vis works of other writers like Amitav Ghosh or Abdul Razak Gurna, who have used this paradigm of ocean, in tackling with these intersected, complicated concerns? So that is my one question. And my second question is, we often talk about colonization, impact of colonization. We're obsessed with this subject. But your works also point towards the negative impact of decolonization. So I was just wondering if you would like to tell us more about your views on decolonization, both these questions, if you could take them together.
Address the first question. Writers don't necessarily read other writers, especially the more they are like them. So I have not read Amitav Ghosh except this book, The Antique Land, where I was asked to read it, and I had to interview him on stage for the festival here a long time ago, and I thought it was a marvelous book. Very honest book in terms of its voice. So I enjoyed it, but I've not read his other books. And same with Rohinton Mystery, although I published one of his stories in our literary magazine long time ago. Same with Ondach, I read excerpts from him. So we don't, because you're so absorbed, there's a lot of vanity involved, to be honest. And
Yeah.
you don't want to be compared or to compare yourself, or because as soon as I read about another book, or I read a review, and I say, "What am I doing here?" I have to go back to my own work. So, and you don't want to be influenced. Same with Naipaul. I read his early books, but then I kept away from him because, again, there was a certain resonance there, and I didn't want to be influenced to anything. I read his essays, and I thought they were brilliant. Didn't agree with them, but still, uh, you know. So that's easy to answer. You don't, and if you ask them, they've not read me either. In terms of colonization, I think colonization has had a very profound impact on people of my generation because I was brought up in a place which was still a British territory, and Kenya was still a British colony, and we looked up to the British. I never faced any negative experiences. We had teachers, British teachers who were excellent teachers. We still remember them. But this feeling of a difference of race, of superior and inferior, it takes decades to go away, if it ever does. In fact, if anything, it makes you more bristling, You look for racism and it's not there. And when you've suffered a slight, you only discover about it a day later. You know? So that's a very profound, damaging impact it has had. But it's over. We all realize that. I'm not one of those who blames the British for everything.
No, I was asking
They
about
are
the.
doing badly, corruption. If you look at any African politician, big belly, a lot of money, and it's all blame the British. Enough. What are we doing? You get on with it. People have suffered, and I'm reading the history of medieval India at present for my future work, and you find that people in those days, the wars were so savage. There was slavery there. They would enslave people by the tens of thousands. If you read the biography of either Nadir Shah or Timur Lang, and you find out how many people they killed. They took away women and children as slaves. People suffered. They moved on. So there's no point saying, "Oh, the British did it." I said, forget about it. And we are adults. We have to get on.
Mm. No, but I was asking about the impact of decolonization that you talk about in your work.
Decolonization is the same thing where you blame the colonists. Yeah, I guess what you're saying is what Googie said, in terms of getting rid of some of the baggage of colonialism. One, of course, is racism, how to get rid of the impact of racism. And the other is, the others you can't. Even Googie, he says he writes in Kikuyu, but it's always published, reviewed in English. And the other African writers don't agree with him writing in Swahili because we don't understand it, and his grandchildren might not understand it. When we started, we say get rid of italics for using Indian words. We will put our own Indian words, Indian language in our writing, and you find your own children don't understand. So it's a very complex thing, that decolonization. I think just being honest and independent is decolonizing, changing names of cities and names of streets. To some degree, of course, it's necessary. When we had Queensway and Kingsway, and at some point, it's okay, enough. So we already did that in the first decades. And now what? 60 years after independence, 70 years after independence, you still blame the British? I don't know. I mean, there's some blame to be left, but we should move on. India is a huge country, and it's a rich country.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that expansive sweep of your talk, and also for leaving us with much to think about at the end. That when one thinks about the deep wound on our lives, the deep wound of colonialism, whether it's in Asia or Africa, and it's also time for us to think about the other histories that were happening at the time of colonialism, which allowed the movements of people from India to Africa, from India to Europe, and the huge diaspora that was created at the same time as colonialism happened. And that's a space from which you write and think. So thank you so much for joining us. And Nishat, any last words before we pass on to the audience?
No, I echo your thoughts, Dilip. Thank you so much, Dr. Vassanji. I mean, it was really sort of, you expect writers to talk in the same language that you academics are used to, or sort of assume that writers should talk. So you have given us again a kind of different language, different grammar, and a different perspective, writerly perspective. With this, I pass it to Grace and Stephen to take up questions from the chat box, because as I can see, there are quite a few questions. So Stephen and Grace.
Thank you.
Wow, I mean, extraordinary questions and magnificent answers. So now I'll club few questions together so that you can answer them together. So there is a question by T. Vijay Kumar. He asks, how does this in-betweenness get reflected in the language of
I
your
think I'll
writing?
step in. If you have a patchy network, I'll step in.
Yeah, you can.
So it's fine. I think he was audible.
He is audible.
Yeah.
Okay. And the other question is by Himadri Lehri. She asks, what role does the ocean play as an in-between space for those who left the Indian shore as an indentured laborer?
The second question I remember was it's obviously indentured laborers didn't. Well, in East Africa, mostly people went as traders, except in Kenya, some Punjabis came to build the railway as indentured laborers. Uh, I don't think the lives of Punjabis, if I've, and of course I've dealt with that in my book Vikram Lal, were as negative as they were in the Caribbean, for example. In the Caribbean, Indians arrived as mostly as individuals, whereas in East Africa they came as communities, entire communities. So which is why they're more conservative, but at the same time more secure. In the Caribbean, people went as individuals, so they formed these bonds on the ships, which they call Jahaji Bai. So basically, people of the ship. And it was very quickly, a lot of them lost their language, lot of them lost their faith, which some of them are now reclaiming. I happen to know a lot of them in Toronto and Canada now through my work as an editor. So I know their stories, but and some of the stories they tell are really tragic. If you look at Ismail Khan, or there's a writer who died earlier, Harold Soni Ladu, some other writers, Cyril Debidin or Arnold Itwaru, even their names tell you, or even, what's his name? Bisundat. They write about lives, very painful lives, broken homes, abuse, and so on. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that is the difference in between. If you want to bring in the word ocean, people who went across the ocean to Africa, which was a very short distance, or went around the Cape, or to the Caribbean. Does that? And the first question was in betweenness. It's just you're just between places in terms of how you speak, what you eat, even what you worship. Sometimes, in terms of worship, people become more conservative the farther they go, and at least conservative in worship. In East Africa, we found that people, because we came, this is my community only, we came with these bhajans, or what we call ginans. And when I went to Gujarat, I found that we in East Africa had preserved that heritage much more intact than it had been preserved in the villages of Gujarat. I was amazed. I thought when I went there, I would find manuscripts and books, and nothing of the sort. Whereas in Dar es Salaam, there were lots of manuscripts, lots of books. So those are the differences. I don't know how much that answers the question, but in betweenness, you sometimes have to find the in betweenness. You can't pinpoint it. It's in food, it's in language, it's in faith, it's in family relations. How much you keep in touch with your family in Gujarat, for example. I didn't know any of them. Then I learned that one of my aunts had a relation in Jamnagar, and then I would hear from my grandmother stories that she came from near Jamnagar, and my mother said it's a place called Jamjodhpur, but to us, India meant Bombay.
Thank you, sir, for that those answers. There are the first two questions were about in betweenness. Now the next three questions are about belongingness. So the first question is by Richa Sharma. She asked, the way you describe belongingness, I feel a strong resemblance of your experiences to that of Munir's inner Delhi obsession. Does the character metaphorically represent your predicaments? Then Claude Monica asks, does the question of belonging relate to one's cultural values? Then Ninu Kumar is asking, you mentioned that you have multiple identities. Has that in any way hindered your sense of belongingness?
We need to go question by question. I forgot the first one.
Sir, it was about does the character of Munir in Delhi
Yeah, it
Obsession
does.
represent your predicaments?
Yeah, he does to some degree. Although I have painted him, I have made him come from more orthodox community. At least his grandfather was, and also his grandfather is directly from Delhi, which is not my background. So at least I wanted to put some distance between me and that character. But in the sense of his being a westernized Indian, that he does reflect my beliefs. That when you say the Muslims did this, he says, but Muslim, but what do you mean Muslim? Some Muslims did it. I wasn't there. So in that sense, yes. And the second question?
It's about belongingness to one's cultural values.
Well, yeah, the belongingness to cultural values is, I think, for me, is fundamental. For some people, belonging to their faith is more fundamental. For me, the culture, the ethnicity is more important, and belongingness. And I was, as I said, deeply influenced by the songs that I heard in my childhood, which is what brought me to India, or kept returning to India in the first place. Just that tie, the songs, that spoke to me directly. And that's the cultural value. There were, of course, other cultural values in, how you speak to your elders. We were taught to respect our sisters and respect our mothers. So if my son would speak a little, be rude to my mother, I said, you dare not be rude to your mother. He talked to me like that. So, there are certain values we thought, we believed were Indian. But we didn't stick to them because we thought they were Indian. They were just our values, which I interpret to be to have come from our community identity. That you respect your women, you respect your sisters and daughters, and so on.
And the
And the
third
third
one
one,
was about multiple identities that, if they have it hindered your sense of belongingness.
well, I didn't. Well, initially, yes, because initially I was really bothered when I first finished university. And even in university, when I went to college in Boston, I felt, what am I? Which later took me decades to realize is the wrong question, because you are what you are. Everything that's gone into you is what you are. So I'm an African because I come from there. Once I was traveling by bus and I looked at outside and the grass, I said, even the grass is me. And then, of course, the language of course Swahili, but Kutchi and Gujarati and how we speak. That, of course, is also my belongingness. When I went to India, I felt there were many things which I could not accept. Well, not many, a few things. One of them was the violence, which I thought, this is not me. We never had this in Africa. But there were some things which spoke to me, and I thought, this is a spiritual homecoming. Africa was the physical homecoming of the memory of my childhood. And of Toronto is my home because everywhere I go in Toronto, I know exactly where I'm going. I know all the streets. I know everything that's going on here. I feel the safest here. So, it's not a hindrance, was what I am. The thing is not to ask, but just to accept. It takes a long time. It took me a long time to come to that awareness. Some people maybe do it automatically.
There are many overlapping questions, out of which, I mean, you have answered few of them as well in the discussions too. But I'll ask a question, which my co-scholar Grace asks. She asks that you were trained as a nuclear scientist. How did you start writing stories? How did you think about it?
That is the easiest question because you just write. A lot of physicists have been violinists. Music, although music and physics are relatively more abstract, but it's not something that like a job description. So today I will do this. It just comes to you. So I remember as a child, wishing something. I was reading something that was set in where I lived. You always read about Famous Five or Agatha Christie, or a lot of the reading was very popular, set elsewhere, which we enjoyed. I mean, I enjoyed those books. Still remember them. But once in a while you think, but what about a book set here? And the older you grow, the more urgent that question becomes. So I don't know, I forgot what the question was. That's it.
So thank you so much for answering those many questions, and there are so many other questions as well in the chat box, which we will have to skip because of the paucity of time. I would like to thank Professor Menon and Professor Zaidi for chairing this session, and over to you, Professor Zaidi.
Yes, I think it's time for us to close. Thank you so much, Dr. Vassanji, for being here with us early in the morning. I know you would have preferred evening time, but I kind of insisted that it doesn't work, considering that we are coming from 3 different time zones, and you very kindly and graciously agreed to it. Thank you so much. It's really kind of you.
Sure.
And we really enjoyed this conversation with you, and you have given us so much to think about. And of course, reconsider our entire oceanic project in the light of what you have said. Thank you so much.
And thank you from my side as well. And we'll, Nishat, as a continuation of this series, we shall have another writer who presumably Mr. Vassanji will not have read, or maybe he has read, keeping with his principle of not reading other writers. We have Abdul Razak Gurna, whom we shall be interviewing early next week as part of the ongoing series on writers who think with the ocean, think with fluidity. And it was great to finally meet you, sir, the author of many of my shelf is stacked with your volumes. So it's finally nice to speak with you. And perhaps we should end here. And apologies to those whose questions could not be answered. I don't know whether Mr. Vassanji is open to people emailing him with importunate and dense queries, but we shall leave open that possibility. Maybe Nishat could be in touch with you